Welcome to Elementary Math Chat, a podcast for all elementary math teachers looking for ideas and support when it comes to teaching elementary math. I'm your host, Anna Marie Kretzy from Kretzy Creations, and after 20 years of teaching 4th and 5th grade math, I am ready to share my experiences in the classroom to help improve yours. Whether you are a brand new teacher, new to teaching math, or simply looking for a change, join me each week as we discuss all things elementary math. Let's get started. Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Elementary Math Chat. Today is going to be another content-specific episode on multiplying a fraction by a whole number and multiplying a fraction by a fraction. It has been a while since I've done a content-specific episode. My last one was on interpreting remainders back in episode 16, so I'm well overdue for one of these, and I'm excited to share a few tips on multiplying fractions. Let's begin this one by breaking down the standard so we can understand exactly what it's looking for. When I look at this standard, there are two things that stand out to me. Number one, it really wants you to focus on the fact that when you multiply a fraction by a whole number, or a fraction by a fraction for that matter, we want students to understand that these are factors. They're not going to be whole number factors, but they are factors since you're multiplying two numbers to get a product. And the other thing that stands out is when you multiply a whole number times a fraction, you are combining equal groups just like they did with whole numbers, except this time there's a fraction involved. So in a nutshell, this is really wanting you to teach for conceptual understanding and do your best every lesson to connect what they're about to learn with fractions to what they already know with whole numbers. All right, well, let's kick things off with my first tip, and I'm going to start in 4th grade. My first tip is for probably the first lesson you'll teach in this unit, where you express a fraction as the product of a whole number in a unit fraction. For example, 7/8 is 7 groups of 1/8. This is a very different way of thinking about fractions because they're used to thinking of 7/8 as 7 out of 8 equal parts. So to all of a sudden think about it as a multiplication equation is really confusing. So it's important that you start this lesson out with fraction tiles. The first thing I had them do was take their fraction tiles and model the fraction 7/8. And then I had them write it as a sum of unit fractions. They already knew how to do this. They learned it in the previous chapter. So I'm building on their prior knowledge. So they would write 7/8 equals 1/8 plus 1/8 plus 1/8 and so on. It is a lot to write, and so I would kind of act a little annoyed, like, 1/8 plus 1/8 plus 1/8. Can anyone think of a shortcut so we don't have to write this repeated addition of 1/8? And of course, they're going to say, yes, we can multiply. But I didn't go straight to the multiplication. I had them next write what we had modeled using the words groups of. 7/8 is 7 groups of 1/8. This is helpful because, number one, it's exactly what they have modeled in front of them, but number two, it reinforces the connection to multiplication. So again, we started with repeated addition, then we wrote it as 7/8 is 7 groups of 1/8, and then finally we ended by writing it as an equation with a multiplication sign. After a few examples, they'll be able to do it without the models and without the extra steps, but this is a really good way to introduce this skill and connect it to their prior knowledge. My second tip on multiplying fractions is when you are teaching them to name the multiples of fractions. So this is where you're counting by unit fractions and non-unit fractions. This was the second lesson I taught, and I really did like this lesson because it makes sense for them to start out with multiples of fractions. That's how they learned it with whole numbers. They first learned to skip count 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 before they learn to do multiplication. So making those connections from the beginning, I think, is so important when you're heading into fractions. One of my favorite ways that I practiced naming multiples is using round robin and rally robin. Those are Kagan strategies that I talked about back in episode 20. But in case you're not familiar with those, rally robin is where they name the multiples back and forth with a partner. So let's say they're naming multiples of 1/4. One person would start by saying 1/4. Their partner would say 2/4, and then they would say 3/4, and they keep going until you say stop. When you do say stop, have them take the improper fraction that they ended on and change it to a mixed number as an extension. This is helpful because eventually they're going to have to change their answers that are improper fractions back to mixed numbers when they start multiplying fractions. So it's a good way to review that skill. Then do the same thing with non-unit fractions like 2/3 or 3/4. So again, one person says 2/3, the other says 4/3, and then 6/3, and so on. This also works well in small groups using the round-robin format. So instead of going back and forth, they will go around your small group table and name the multiples of unit fractions or non-unit fractions. And then, again, practice changing the improper fraction they end on to a mixed number. All right, let's move on to my third tip for multiplying fractions. And this one applies to the lesson where you teach them that two equations can be equal. For example, 2 times 3/5 is equal to 6 times 1/5. And here's a really good way to start this lesson. Either on your board or in your slides, put up a few whole number equations and have a missing factor. For example, you could write 3 times 4 equals 2 times blank. So that would be 6. Another one you could write is 5 times 4 equals 20 times blank. This is exactly what you're about to teach them with fractions, so it's a really strategic way to start your lesson. So let's get to the main part of your lesson. One of my favorite ways to introduce a concept is using a work mat. I just love how you can take one skill and you can write it different ways and you can model it and it can all be on one page. And so I created one specifically for this lesson. The work mat also comes with a bonus 4-section activity mat that you can use in small groups. So that will be linked in the show notes if you want to take a look. What I love about the work mat is it's super simple and it's organized into 3 parts. The top part is where they write the equations, the middle section is where they model with fraction tiles, and then in the bottom, there is a fill in the blank statement where they write it in words. Let me walk you through a quick example. Let's say they start off by modeling 3 groups of 3/4. So they would do that on one side and then write the equation 3 times 3/4. Then they would separate those fraction tiles into unit fractions, so 9 groups of 1/4, and then in the equation side, they would write 9 times 1/4. At the bottom, then they would fill in the blanks and say that 3 groups of 3/4 is the same as 9 groups of 1/4. I know you may be thinking, man, that means every student needs 9/4 and only 4/4 come in a student's set. So if you don't have enough, there are a couple things you can do. You can print off a few printable fraction tiles, and that way you can give them more than they would get in a typical set. Or you can have them pull up the digital fraction tiles to model. But if you don't want to do that, another option is to glue this work mat in their notebooks and have them draw the fraction tiles instead. I did have enough to give everyone a large amount because we had a ton of extra fraction tiles, and our math coach did us a huge favor and she organized them by fractions. So all the half pieces were in one container and all the thirds were in another. So my teammates and I went up and grabbed the entire tub of 6ths and 8ths, I think is what we used for this lesson. So that would be my recommendation if you have enough extras. Hey, 4th grade teachers. I'm interrupting this episode for a brief moment because state testing is right around the corner, and I know you might be feeling a little anxious and unsure about the best way to prepare your students. That's why I want to make sure you know about my all-inclusive test prep kit with everything you'll need the week before state testing. This kit includes 4 interactive PowerPoint lessons, plus an editable choice board with printable and digital activities included. This means you're getting 4 sets of boom cards, 4 independent practice worksheets, and 4 partner worksheets, plus a few extras to make your test prep week a breeze. All you have to do is make the copies because the rest has been done for you. For more information, visit the show notes and click on Test Prep Kit or head to kretzycreations.com/test prep. All right, let's head back to the episode. Let's move on to my 4th tip for multiplying fractions. And this one is for when you actually start multiplying a fraction by a whole number. This is a tip I learned from Greg Tang, and it is such a clever way to start this lesson. Start by writing this phrase on the board. 2 groups of 5 dogs equals blank. And keep everything in word form except the 2 and the 5. You want those to stand out. So your students are going to answer with 10 dogs. Repeat with a similar phrase like 3 groups of 7 apples equals blank. They will answer with 21 apples. Then move to a phrase like 4 groups of 3/8 equals blank. In this third example, I changed what they were grouping to be a fraction, but it's still in word form, so they may not even notice. And so they will follow the pattern and answer with 12/8. Now, take that same statement, 4 groups of 3/8, and write it as 4 times 3/8. And the only thing you want to keep in word form is the eighths. They will once again answer with 12/8. Then you're going to write it one final time without any words. So you're giving them the multiplying a whole number times a fraction equation. 4 times 3/8 equals blank. By now they've seen the pattern. They've discovered that the denominator is what you're grouping, so it's always part of the answer, just like the dogs and the apples were in the first few examples. So I can pretty much guarantee you that they're going to get that last one correct. They'll know that 4 times 3/8 equals 12/8. This is also something to keep in mind if you have students start struggling with this concept later on. Go back to this whole idea of putting it in word form, and I think it'll help them figure out what they're doing wrong. This seems like a pretty simple and straightforward concept, but a common mistake I saw often is when they multiplied a fraction by a whole number, they would change it to an improper fraction. So I always made a point to show both of these side by side and addressed how they are not the same thing. 5 times 1/4 is not the same thing as 5 and 1/4. I think a lot of them discover the shortcut for changing a mixed number to an improper fraction, and so sometimes they stick a multiplication sign in between the 5 and the 4. So I'm pretty sure that's why they're making that mistake. The most frustrating part is that if they ever see something like 5 times 1/4 on a multiple choice test, don't you think choice A is going to be 21/4? It always is. It's a huge distractor. So even if you're not seeing this mistake, I would address it early. One thing that did help my students, and I actually noticed one of my girls doing this on her own, is to circle the whole number with the numerator, like put a horizontal circle around it, because that's what you're really multiplying, and the denominator gets written underneath it. Don't you love it when you learn things from your students that you can pass on to others? So that's a great tip if you have some students struggle with this. Now, I know in 5th grade that you teach students to put a 1 under the whole number, and that makes sense for you, but I do not recommend doing that for 4th grade because it really takes the focus off of the meaning behind combining equal groups of the fraction. So save that one for 5th grade. So that takes care of the 4th grade skills. We ended up not multiplying a fraction by a mixed number because when we dug deep into the standard, we couldn't find any proof that we needed to teach this skill, which was kind of a relief because we felt like in the past when we taught that skill, it was really confusing for them and they kind of forgot everything they had learned about multiplying a fraction by a whole number. So my last few years, we kept it simple and we just did a fraction by a whole number. Let's move on to 5th grade now. It has been a while since I've taught 5th grade, but there are 2 things I remember being extremely helpful. As I mentioned earlier, in 5th grade, when you multiply a fraction by a whole number, you teach them to put a 1 under the whole number and make it a fraction times a fraction. And I really wanted to make sure that they understood why we put a 1 under the whole number. Why not a 2? Why not a 3? Why not the same number as the whole number? I felt like if I didn't address this, then they wouldn't understand what they're doing and they might put a 1 on top of the whole number as the numerator instead. So what I did is I started out with a number talk and I put a whole bunch of fractions on the board, but I made sure that all of the numerators were the same. It was only the denominators that changed. And we just practiced going through and reading them. So let's say they all had a numerator of 2. We would read 2/5, 2/4, 2/3, 2/2. And then I had one that said 2/1. So we went through and read them, and they knew how to read all of them, except they did not know how to read the 2/1. Some of them would say 2/1, and while literally that's what's written, they had a hard time telling me what that meant. They could tell me that 2/5 was 2 out of 5 equal parts. They could tell me that 2/3 was 2 out of 3 equal parts, but it was pretty clear that they didn't understand what the 1 meant. So then I showed them a picture of all of these fractions. They already knew what the other fractions were going to look like, but when they got to the 2 wholes, they could clearly see that 2/1 meant 2 wholes. They weren't broken into smaller pieces, they were in one whole piece. This is like when you take a pizza out of the oven and you haven't cut it yet. It's one whole pizza. Once you cut it, then those pieces become fractions, but until you do so, it's one whole pizza. And that's why whole numbers have a denominator of 1. After that, we went through a few more examples of looking at some visuals of whole numbers and then practiced writing them with a denominator of 1 and then reading them out loud. 4/1 means 4 wholes. 3/1 means 3 wholes, and so on. Another helpful tip was a little rhyme I made up, and this one is for multiplying fractions, and they would repeat each line after me. It goes like this, and you have to clap along when you do this. Multiplying fractions is no problem, so then they would say multiplying fractions is no problem, top times top and bottom times bottom. That's the first part of the rhyme, and I love it because it reminds them of how simple this concept is. It also helps them when they have a mixed number because they'll have to write it as an improper fraction to get a top and a bottom. Now, the second part of the rhyme is reduce to get those numbers down, criss, cross, or up and down. When we said this part, I had them do the crisscross and the up and down motions as well. This is going to remind them to simplify either a numerator and denominator from the two different fractions or within the same fraction. So from start to finish, multiplying fractions is no problem. Top times top and bottom times bottom. Reduce to get those numbers down, criss, cross, or up and down. Now, of course, I think it's extremely important to draw and shade models of multiplying fractions, and that way they can see proof of how their answers get smaller. I always reminded them that when they multiplied two fractions, they were finding part of a part. So of course it made sense that their answers were getting smaller, just like when they multiplied a fraction by a whole number, their answer also got smaller. And I'm sure that's the way most teachers teach this skill, but I wanted to mention it just in case. So those are my teaching tips for multiplying fractions. Hopefully you gained a few ideas and some tips that you can try with your students. All right, well, let's wrap up with today's teaching tip of the week. Today's tip is an idea for a small group activity that involves two of my favorite things, task cards and puzzles. And here's how it works. Let's say you have 6 students at your small group table. Each pair will need a stack of task cards and then 1 puzzle. And you'll want to make sure you have 3 different puzzles so they don't see each other's puzzle. When they get to your small group table, the puzzles will be inside of a Ziploc bag. And their goal is to put the puzzle back together. They do this by solving task cards. So for every task card that they answer correctly, they get to pull a piece of the puzzle out of the bag. Then once they have all the pieces out, they are finished solving the task cards and then they can work together to put the puzzle back together. As far as the puzzles go, I always found 8 to 10 pieces was the perfect amount. And I will put a link in the show notes to some really simple but fun puzzles that you can print that have 8 to 10 pieces. This is an activity that my students always enjoyed, and you know I'm a fan of task cards, but sometimes it's nice to mix things up, and adding in this puzzle element is the perfect way to do so. Well, friends, that is all for today's episode. Have a great week, and I will see you next Tuesday. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Elementary Math Chat. If you enjoy this podcast, it would mean so much if you could share it with a teacher friend to help spread the word, and subscribe or follow so you never miss an episode. For more information, be sure to check out the show notes with links to related blog posts and resources. Talk to you next week.